Chapter 19 Design for Checkmate. In this chapter, we're going to be looking at the various different patterns that are involved in creating checkmates. Of course, every checkmate is different, but there are a lot of themes and motifs that can help you to spot a checkmate in advance and to help you aim for the checkmate. As one of these quotes at the start of the chapter says, "As soon as a true thought has entered our mind, it gives a light which makes us see a crowd of other objects which we have never perceived before." And the reason that's relevant is because when you now will know these mating patterns, when they enter into your mind, it will give you a light by which you'll be able to see and evaluate the positions you're in and guide them towards the mating patterns that you know about. So, these diagrams are going to be forms and patterns and basic setups, not actual concrete positions. But I think there is a lot of value in going through them and studying them. So without further ado, let's look at the designs for checkmate. In the first example, we have a queen in a situation where we have a pawn and the opposing side has 3 pawns, and we're going to try and break through. The way this can most effectively be done is by pushing that f-pawn to f6. We're now immediately threatening checkmate on g7. Black can only hold off by advancing the g-pawn, thereby blocking the advance of our queen, but only temporarily. For now, we can play queen h6, and we are threatening checkmate again. This time, it cannot be stopped. Now, this checkmating pattern is known, at least in modern days, as far as I'm aware, as the lobster pincer mate. Let's see more examples. So after the rook moves, for example, that's what the checkmate looks like. In this example, we see how a queen and a bishop can combine to give a checkmate. In this example, it's on h7. Very important to know how to use the queen and the bishop together. In this example, you might be tempted to take the bishop, but don't forget, you can actually create a checkmate on h7 with the queen supported by the pawn. So it's a very similar pattern to before. Here again, we see a similar pattern, but it's different. This time the queen is supported by a rook. And with the rook, the queen can give a checkmate either on h7 or h8. In this example, we see how the queen combines with the knight. Of course, we don't give the checkmate on f7 because there that is guarded by the rook. Instead, we go to h7, and that's mate. In this example, clearly we have the knight and the queen combining again, and the checkmate is to be had, this time on g7. Here we have a lobster pincer mate, but from the other direction. So this time, rather than the queen being on h6 and a pawn being on f6, they've swapped positions, but their effect is the same. We still end up with a checkmate on g7 with a queen supported by a pawn. In this position, it's very similar to the lobster pincer mate, but instead of the queen being supported by a pawn, the queen is supported by her bishop. Checkmate is given on the same square. In this example, we still have the same basic pattern, but rather than the diagonals of the bishop and the queen converging, they are in fact on the same diagonal. The resulting position is the exact same. It's checkmate either on g7 or on h8, with the queen supported by the bishop. In this case, it's a very similar checkmate, but this time the mating piece is a rook. The rook can give checkmate on h8, supported by the bishop, and the king has no recourse. You can see that we're learning here, hopefully, these basic patterns. As we move on, we'll see these patterns implemented in more concrete examples. Here we see how we can use a knight and a rook to give a checkmate on h7. The king can't run away because the knight covers that square. The knight also defends the rook, which in turn covers the g7 square. In this example, we see that we've got two rooks on the 7th rank, and we can give a checkmate by using the b rook to come over and trap the king, g7. In this example, we see for the first time something called a smothered mate. And the smothered mate begins with knight f7, check, and you can see that this completely forces the king to step into an alignment with our queen. And then our knight can jump away to h6, providing a check to the king. Now, it's actually a double check because our queen also checks the king. The king certainly can't move to f8, because if it does, we will land our queen there, and that will be all she wrote. Therefore, the king moves back into the corner. And if you've not seen a smothered mate before, I would urge you to think about how you would proceed from here. It's not at all obvious if you've never seen it before, but once you've seen it, the pattern will become familiar. The correct answer is actually queen to g8, and it's a queen sacrifice. Now, the king cannot take the queen since it's defended by the knight, but the rook can take the queen. The reason it's called a smothered mate is because now the knight can jump back over to f7, giving a check to the king, and the king is smothered by its own pieces. It has nowhere to go and nowhere to breathe. As it happens, there is another potential mating pattern to learn from this example, and that is after knight f7 and king g8, we could also play knight to d8 with the discovered check against the king. Black cannot take the knight because he has to deal with the check against the king. And as we've learned earlier, if the king were to come to f8, then we would have queen to f7 checkmate. Therefore, the king has to go back to the corner, and this allows queen e8 check. And once black blocks that once, we can then take that queen, and it's a checkmate this way as well. So in fact, there are two ways to force checkmate in this example. More commonly though, or not super common, but you will definitely see it, and if you don't see it, then it might be implicit in the games you play, is the concept of this smothered mate. Moving on, we see another example, white to move. We've already seen an example with the queen and the bishop being able to give a checkmate on h7. In this example, we see that the only reason we can't do that is because of this knight here on f6. And from that observation, we come up with the move bishop takes knight, because if black recaptures the bishop, there's our mating pattern coming to life. So now we can see this basic forms that we've been looking at being put into more concrete play. This is what's going to happen in your own games as well. This is a very interesting example. From the white perspective, our queen is under attack. However, thinking further ahead about how our rook might be able to combine with our bishops to give a mate, we can actually foresee a potential future where we can sacrifice this queen by taking the knight first. Now, if our queen is taken, we've suddenly got a lot of power against this king, and we can play rook takes bishop check. When the king moves, we can slide our rook across to the h-file, and we're actually threatening checkmate on the next move. Now, this is very difficult to stop. One of the only ways to do it is by sacrificing the queen on g4, but after we take the queen, our threat of rook h8 still exists, and black has not solved their problems. So here, black tries to run with the king immediately, so that after rook h8, at least he can duck with the king over to d7. In one problem with that is that we can then take the rook. The other problem is we still have our other bishop that can come up here and deliver a final checkmate. So that's what we do. We give a check, and then we give another check, and it's mate. This whole thing came about because just like when a truth illuminates in your mind a certain something that allows you to see things in a new way, now that we've seen certain mating patterns and the way that a rook can combine with a bishop to give essentially a checkmate with the bishop covering a diagonal and the rook covering the horizontal and the vertical, that's what allows us to see we can potentially sacrifice the queen by taking the knight with the bishop, sacrificing the queen, forcing a check where the king moves, and then stepping across here, looking in to give that exact kind of a checkmate pattern. And that's exactly the reason why this works. Let's move on. In this example, it is black to move. Now here, we might not otherwise see it, but because we previously saw an example where we had two rooks on the 7th rank that were able to essentially force a checkmate, this time we can't do that, but only because this pawn is defended by the rook. And because of that, because we're aware of this pattern, we come up with the idea of queen takes rook. Now, after pawn takes queen, we can play. Rook takes pawn check, king moves, we give another check, the king moves back, and now we use our other rook to deliver the final checkmate. And that's essentially the same pattern we saw earlier over on this side of the board. And we can see how those basic patterns and forms are informing us of certain moves that we might be able to make. In this example, it's white to move. Complex position in some respects, until you realize that there is a way to use one of the checkmate patterns that we saw earlier. And that is the pattern of a queen and a knight working together. We can play queen to h6, and we're threatening queen g7 checkmate. There is no good way for black to prevent this. Black can prolong their agony by giving their queen for a rook with check. We then retreat the bishop to block the check. Now, the best black can do is try and bring the queen in here with a check and also an attack on our queen. Now, we can just simply take that queen with our knight, and it's true we're no longer threatening checkmate, but we've won a lot of material. We've won a knight and we've won a queen for a knight and a rook, which is a bit of material. We also have the option, though, to win an extra knight here if we want. Stockfish says what's best is to actually throw in the threat of another checkmate pattern first, with bishop d3, threatening the queen and bishop checkmate. And that forces black to try and break the communication between our bishop and our queen. And at this point, we can give a check to the king, which is unnecessary, but we can. And when the king moves, we do end up winning that extra piece. So these checkmate patterns, they're not only useful in providing checkmates, but they're also useful in providing threats of mate, the defense of which requires your opponent to give up material that you can then use to win the rest of the game. In this example, it's white to move. And once again, the ability to win the game comes from our knowledge of the patterns of checkmate. In this case, we see that we have a knight here, and we can combine that knight with our rook to provide a checkmate up here, if only this rook was not in the way. And from that, we get the idea of playing queen to h7 check. The king cannot recapture nor move away. The only move is rook captures queen, but because the rook has moved out of this file, we can play rook g8 check, and it's supported by the knight. It's the pattern we saw earlier in a different form now, but it has won us this game. In this example, it's again white to move. And again, this is an example of the lobster pincer mate coming to fruition. We can start with h6. When the king moves, queen f6, king moves again. And here we have the queen landing on g7 with checkmate supported by the pawn. These patterns are rife throughout pretty much every chess game. So it pays to know them, and in this position it is black to move. And once again, we are going to be informed by our knowledge of the pattern of a rook and bishop checkmate. If we could have a rook up here, supported by this long-range bishop, it would be a checkmate. Now, as it happens, this pawn is in the way, but we can violently take that pawn out of the way and then use our other rook to provide a check. And when the king moves, even if he inserts a queen in the way first, the king is going to have to move. We then land our checkmate. Now, if you didn't know about this pattern of a rook giving a checkmate by controlling the horizontal and the vertical, while a bishop that supports the rook controls the diagonal, then you may well not have seen the idea of sacrificing a rook for a pawn. But when you do know the pattern, it illuminates these various possibilities. And that's the point of looking at these examples. So let's keep doing that. In this example, it is white to move. And here it again comes down to the idea of using our mate patterns to create threats of mate that either result in mate or the loss of material for our opponent. And one way we can do that here is actually queen h5, directly threatening checkmate on the h7 square with the queen supported by the knight. Now, h6 can be played, which, as we've seen before, is a common way to defend because it blocks our queen from ever reaching the h7 square. But in this case, we can continue on with our attack, making the most of the pin. So this is an example of also combining operations, combining the threat of a checkmate with a pin in order to be able to see the move queen takes knight. And the queen is impervious to capture because of our bishop here on c4. Our knight can be captured, but in that case we recapture with our bishop and we've won a tempo on the queen. A very important tempo. Now, that queen certainly doesn't want to give itself away for just the sake of a bishop, so the queen moves to its only safe square, e8. And now we can play the move bishop f6. And this threatens something that we saw earlier, akin to the lobster pincer mate, but with the queen supported by the bishop rather than by a pawn. This pawn can't take our bishop because it's pinned. This pawn can't take our queen because it's pinned. So we do have to use all of our tools in order to be playing this kind of high-level chess. And it's very easy to not see these ideas, to be blinded by them, to think that you can't play this move because you're going to have your bishop taken, particularly when you're trying to think these things through in advance. Very, very easy to fall prey to illusions on the chessboard, to hallucinations or ghosts. But if we are seeing things clearly and we have a good grasp of patterns and we understand the logic behind them, we should be able to play moves like this at a high quality. And ultimately, that's what's involved in winning chess. Here there's nothing better for black to do than to give the queen away with check, but we simply capture that queen with our knight. Black can then prolong the game by taking a pawn, but it's completely meaningless. We take that pawn with that bishop with our king, and whatever happens next, we are going to land the checkmate. That's the old pattern we've seen before in various forms. Moving on, another example that's white to move. This is a pattern that's quite famous. It happens from time to time, and it's definitely worth knowing. We have this pawn here, and we could provide maybe a variant of the lobster pincer mate if we could get our queen all the way up to the h7 square. The reason we can't do that, though, is because our queen is currently hemmed in by both of these rooks. What we can do is move these rooks away with tempo. We can move one of them away with a check, and when the king moves, we can play the quite phenomenal move of rook h8 check. Just simply giving the rook away, forcing the king to capture the rook, and then we can repeat the procedure by doing the same with our next rook, moving it across to the h-file with a check, forcing the king back to g8, and then once again sacrificing an entire rook. So we've now given away 2 rooks, but now we get to move our queen across to the h-file with check, and when the king moves, this time we do not sacrifice the queen up on h8, instead we play queen h7, supported by the pawn, delivering a checkmate. If you haven't seen that one before, it's really something. So let's look at it again. We can move all of our pieces with tempo against the king. Check, 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 checkmate. A beautiful idea, and one well worth storing away. In this example, once again, we have to combine double attacks, threats of checkmates, using pins in order to come up with the correct move. Now, the correct move is not queen to d4. Queen d4 threatens checkmate on the g7 square. That's true. However, black can simply play queen to f6, and you may win a pawn here, by all means. But we're not only wanting to win a pawn, we want to do better than that, if we possibly can. So a much better move here, incomparably better really, is the idea of playing queen g4. From g4 we have the same threat against g7. We might still play g7 mate if given a chance. It's just that now queen f6 doesn't work because our bishop simply would capture this queen. So therefore, black resorts to this familiar idea in terms of a defending idea of pushing that attacked pawn forward to prevent our queen from reaching the desired g7 square. How then do we now proceed? Now we combine the idea of going to queen d4. The reason this works now is because this idea of queen f6 no longer works. This queen is not defended by a pawn anymore, and we can simply capture it, and no matter what happens on the next move, we are going to be able to deliver mate either on g7 or h8, or for that matter, on g5. Similarly, this pawn, which is pinned, cannot move forward to block the check or the potential of mate. So that's a very nice example where we threaten mate in a way where defending it is futile, thereby winning not only a lot of material, but the whole game with it. In this example, it's, again, white to move. And our knowledge of the mating patterns, in particular the pattern of a queen supported by a knight, is what's going to help us here to see clearly the possibilities that other players might not see. And that possibility in this case is in fact sacrificing a bishop for the pawn on h7. Check. Here, if our bishop is accepted, we can play queen h5 check, forcing the king back to g8, and then knight g5, threatening the checkmate on h7, which is a pattern we've learned before. And the only way to stop that now is for black to give up their queen for our knight, at which point we've won a lot of material. Once again, it's paying to know these checkmate patterns. In this example, once again it's white to move. And can you see the checkmate? Be very careful because it's not always the pattern that we've seen before. And if you thought about queen h7, that would in fact be a mistake, because if you play queen h7, black can run away to the f8 square, and then it's very difficult to continue the attack. However, here is where we learn another new pattern. We can actually play bishop h7 so that we provide a check, but we do so in a way where we also cut the king off. The king cannot run away. The only place the king can run is to the side, where we are still very much menacing that king. Now we can retreat our bishop, giving a check, a discovered check that is, forcing the king back to g8, and now we can provide queen h7 check, because as the king tries to run the other way, we are now supported by our bishop and can play queen f7 checkmate. This again is worth seeing a second time. We can play bishop h7, check, forcing the king here, and then we have to choose carefully where we retreat the bishop to. But in this case, we want to be able to ultimately land our queen on f7, therefore we want our bishop to support that square. We give the check, then we check the king towards the mating square, and deliver the mate. In this example, it is white to move. Once again here, we're going to be using a pattern we learned earlier, the pattern of a smothered mate. Can you see how we can bring that about? Well, the answer is through queen d5, check. There's no piece that can interpose itself between the queen and the king, nor is there a piece that can capture the queen, which means this king must flee. Fleeing towards f8 is lethal because of queen f7 and the pattern of the queen supported by the knight delivering mate. Therefore, black is forced into the corner. And here we can provide knight f7 check, and as the king moves back, this familiar theme of jumping the knight back away to provide a double check, one with the knight and one with the king. Now again, the king cannot come here because then we mate on the f7 square. So the king has to move back to the corner, at which point we can sacrifice our queen. King cannot take it because it's defended by our knight. It must be taken by the rook, and that allows us to then jump back around to f7, providing a check, and that king is smothered and mated. Let's see that again once more. We have the check. King has to run this way because the other way is an immediate mate. We then give a check, which forces the king into our line of fire. We give a double check, again forcing the king into the corner, where we sacrifice our queen in order to hem that king in, and then we provide one last check to the smothered mate. In this example, it's black to move. And in this example, we are going to have to utilize an earlier pattern that we saw, where the queen can give a checkmate when it's supported by a rook. Now, it's not easy to see how to bring this about, but when you're aware that the queen and the rook can combine to give a checkmate, then you start to think about how valuable it would be for us to actually get rid of this pawn, of our own pawn. Now, when I say get rid of it, we don't want to try and push it up, because that's going to involve moving our queen out of the way, moving the pawn. We still have to get rid of this pawn. What we really want to do is move this pawn to the side. And pawns only move to the side diagonally when they're capturing something. And that's all part of the reason why knight g4 is such a great idea. In the first place, we're actually threatening checkmate right now, using the queen supported by the knight. And if white captures our knight, then we get the chance to take back, getting rid of this pawn off the h-file, and again reigniting the idea of a queen checkmate supported by the rook. Here the best move for white is actually to go wild and sacrifice the bishop for a pawn. And it's important here that we don't take the bishop because we don't want to bring our king into any kind of an area where it could become the victim of some sort of an attack. So we simply lift our king up, which connects both of our rooks and reintroduces this threat of checkmate, keeping white on the back foot. White can interrupt the communication between our two major pieces here, but we simply re-establish that communication. Now white tries to run further, moving the rook away so that after queen takes h2, it's no longer mate, the king can run. Now, it would be a terrible mistake to play queen h1, because then there is knight g1 to block the check and to allow the king an escape square. Instead, at this point, we have to retreat and play queen h3 check, which brings the king back towards us, and then we can provide the basic queen checkmate supported by a rook that we saw much earlier on. Now, all of this complicated, forced series of events came about because of our knowledge of checkmating patterns. One of them being queen and rook could give a mate if this pawn wasn't here, and the other one being that with the knight here, we're threatening the mate here as well. And after the knight's taken, we're now threatening mate, as previously mentioned. Whilst there are some stalling tactics here, that's about all there is. With some caution, we end up with a checkmate. In this example, it is white to move, and we are now hopefully getting more and more familiar with some of these checkmate patterns. In this example, we can play queen h6, and we're immediately threatening to give a mate on g7. In fact, there is no defensive move here for black, and no matter what they do, we will be landing there on the next move with checkmate. In this example, it's again white to move, and once again we're using our knowledge of the mating patterns that we've studied thus far to understand that this rook is very mobile. It can give a check, and when the king moves, it can give another check, holding both the horizontal and the vertical lines, whilst the supporting bishop holds the diagonals, resulting in a checkmate. In this example, it is again white to move, and here we are wanting to provide a checkmate. We can see there's the potential for it with our queen and bishop both aiming at the h7 square, so that if our knight was not on the board, our queen could play queen h7 checkmate. Question then is, how do we move the knight away in such a way that we will have time to land queen h7 on the next move? And the answer is, we move that knight away with check, such that it must be dealt with, and then we provide the mate. In this example, once again it's white to move, and there is a very, very nice pattern that we're familiar with, and that pattern involves checkmating by using the queen supported by a rook. It starts with queen h6 check, and there's only one square for that king to go to, after which queen h7 is mate. We've got our queen supported by our rook, and that king's got nowhere to go. And that does it for chapter 19, Design for Checkmate. In the next chapter, we will be looking at the manly art of self-defense.